Good evening. My name is Jim Marten. I'm Professor Emeritus from Marquette University in Milwaukee. And it is my pleasure to be here to talk to you folks about a book I've written recently called The 6th Wisconsin and the Long Civil War, the biography of a regiment. The 6th Wisconsin, as you can see, is one of the original, in the first cohort of regiments recruited in the summer of 1861, hence the 6th Wisconsin. It's the 6th Wisconsin Regiment to go into the Army. It becomes part of the famous Iron Brigade, which we'll talk a little bit about as we go along. It was recruited from towns all over Wisconsin. There are about 8 or 10 counties that provide companies to begin with, the first 10 companies, but eventually during the course of the war, there'll be men from literally every town really in Wisconsin, including 475 draftees, which is a stunningly large number for a Civil War regiment. You can see on the screen out of the 2,000 men that served overall in the regiment, 105 were killed in combat, about the same number died of disease, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, over 50% of the men were either killed, wounded, or discharged for illness, disability. So their casualty rate, when you, again, include illness as a disability, is something like 51, 52%, which is pretty high. As I said, it's an original member of the Iron Brigade, which included also the 7th and 2nd Wisconsin and 19th Indiana, later on the 24th. This slide shows a picture of their distinctive uniforms. These are the old U.S. Army uniforms from before the war, with the black hats, which are also called the Black Hat Regiment quite often. This picture is actually from the 2nd Wisconsin. There's no group picture of the 6th Wisconsin. And also you can see from their battle flag, they are in, once they get into the fighting at Gainesville, which is the precursor to Second Bull Run, they are in virtually all of the major battles fought by the Army of the Potomac between 1862 and 1865. And they will be at Appomattox and take part in the Grand Review in Washington after the war. One of the things about the project is that you see in the upper right-hand corner part of a spreadsheet, which is kind of boring to look at. It's a spreadsheet of 24 data points, as we call them, of all 2,000 guys in the 6th Wisconsin. Now, you can tell not all the data points are filled in for everybody, partly because they died during the war, but we have both pre- and post-war information about many of them. We got that from the roster that was published and can be found online. We got that from information like records from soldiers' homes, which you see in the upper left-hand corner. We got the information from the descriptive role, which you see at the bottom, which has stuff from the roster and many other things. You see it way on the right, little tiny writing that guys in the 1880s did, in Madison in this case, which include notes, including when they were detached, when they were on sick leave, when things that happened to them over the course of the war. And I also looked at a 7-volume set of books called The Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, in which quite a few men from the 6th show up. They collected information about as many of the dead and wounded and sick men as they could, and put them into this compilation for the use of doctors. And I also looked at about 360 pension files, which provides some of the same information, but provides information about their families, about their lives after the war, or if they were killed, their widows and children's lives after the war. And so that's a pretty unique part of the book. So just a very slight notion of the process I went through to provide this sort of long version of the history of a single regiment. This isn't a traditional regimental history. which tend to focus on battles, maybe has a very brief chapter about coming home. I spend about a third of the book on the post-war period, dealing both with, well, we'll see here in a minute. This is kind of the, I'd say, overview of what you'll get out of the book if you're interested. You see the nature of combat is one of the things I talk about. And you saw on the flag a minute ago, the first batch of battles are fights in which the 6th Wisconsin and regiments like them, I think, knew exactly what they had done. And we'll get into a couple of these during the course of the talk tonight. But they knew exactly what their role had been. And even if they lost, they understood their contribution. The second set of battles, Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Petersburg, are very different. They become a cog in a very bloody machine. They have no idea what's going on. They just are moved around with all the other tens of thousands of men in these very confusing battles. And in fact, you have Petersburg there, the long siege of Petersburg. By late summer of 1864, while that siege is kind of being set up, they're down to 70 men. That'll change over the course of the next few months. So I talk a lot about not only the changing nature of combat, but the changing nature of the regiment. And there were at least 3 different cohorts. You see that in the little section called Evolution of a Regiment. The volunteers, again, the 1,000 guys that volunteered in the summer of 1861. And there are dribs and drabs of other volunteers coming in 1862 to 4, maybe another 200, 240 volunteers. But you have a renewal and complete remake of the regiment with the arrival in the fall and early spring of 1864 and 5 of draftees and substitutes. And again, and a few more volunteers showing up. The regiment gets up with some wounded guys coming back and so forth. The regiment gets back up to about 700 men as the late winter, early spring campaign season in 1865 begins. And so really the regiment that finishes the war is very different from the regiment that starts the war. And I go into a lot of detail about that. The long Civil War is, the way I use it, is very commonsensical. What are the long-term effects of the war on the men, but also on families and communities? And so here's where pensions come in. And I talk a lot about the process by which people apply for pensions, what they got pensions for, the problems they faced in getting pensions. The pension files and other records show the long-term health effects of the war. And of course, people lose arms and legs. Don't want to minimize that. That's not the main experience of disabled veterans from the Civil War. Illness is far more likely. And just one of the things I was able to find out, for instance, is that in August of 1862, just before their first battle at Gainesville, there's a brutal 2 or 3 day march in heat and humidity and dust, and it about wrecks the regiment. They're chasing Stonewall Jackson in Northern Virginia. And over the years, in the immediate aftermath, but over the years, there are a number of men who are discharged from the regiment because they're sick, they had heat stroke, whatever. A number of guys trace their rheumatism and other maladies that they claim disability for and receive disability for to that march in early August. And so health is a huge part of the long Civil War. And of course, widows and dependents, both widows whose husbands were killed in the war, but women whose veteran husbands died before them. And so I have a fair amount about them as well. And finally, the more typical traditional version of the long Civil War is the life cycle of memory. The stories they told, the organizations they formed, the memorials they helped raise money for. I think a very moving section about obituaries of men when they live. And so the memory is about what the men thought of themselves, but also what others thought of them. And so this is a basic overview of what you'll find if you decide to look into the book. But over and above that, I have some stories to share. And I'm going to start with where every story of a regiment starts, the gathering and departures of these various companies. I'm going to pick out just one. Company A might as well be the first company to arrive at Camp Randall, which if you follow football, that's where Madison, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, played the football games. And it was the main assembling camp for Wisconsin during the war, Old State Fairgrounds. Company A came from northern Wisconsin, northwestern Wisconsin, not far from the Mississippi River. On a certain day, they get examined very perfunctorily. They're sworn in to state service at this point. And a newspaper article writes about some were too old, some too young, or could not get consent of parents. Some were unsound. But 94 left the town the next day after being sworn in, heading for a town on the river near Prescott, which is where most of them are from, where they picked up another 10 recruits and boarded a steamer to Prairie du Chien, which is along the Mississippi River, where they get on a train for Madison. As they left that morning, their hometown, this is another quote from the newspaper. The boys will have few harder battles to fight than the one they fought on parting, to keep their tears and sighs within their fountains. Many a stern face was wet with tears, and the hot floods dimmed the eyes and bathed the cheeks of hundreds of ladies who had relatives, friends, or neighbors in the ranks. And as they left, the men sang a song, an original song written by one of their own, a Sergeant Henry Diderot, "Hurrah for the Union," which was set to the tune of "Wait for the wagon, wait for the wagon, wait for the wagon." It's kind of a frontier song. And it starts out, "Come brothers, all unite with us, join us one and all. United we must conquer, but divided we shall fall. Our flag is for the Union, and we have a gallant crew who have raised it and who love it. 'Tis the red, white, and blue." And the chorus goes then, "Hurrah for the Union, hurrah for the Union, and the red, white, and blue." And it goes on for a few more verses. I won't sing them for you. But it's sort of as the punctuation to the last moments at home for this particular company. And without the original song, that's the only one I came across, sung by a company from the 6th Wisconsin. Most companies had similar moving, dramatic, evocative departures from their hometowns. And even more, I think, moving in this case is that Diderot, the composer of this song, was killed at the regiment's first battle just over a year later. In fact, it took the 6th Wisconsin a year to get into battle. They are sent to Washington after the first battle of Bull Run, along with the 5th Wisconsin. They spend, again, almost a year, if not even more than a year, in the defenses near Washington or in Culpeper or in various other places. They spend a fair amount of time at Arlington, now the famous National Cemetery, but then, as you might know, Robert E. Lee's home that he, of course, evacuates and immediately becomes a Union military installation on the Virginia side of the Potomac River. And so they wait around, they march around, they train, they gain a new commander in the spring of 1862, John Gibbon, a regular Army artillery officer. But this time they are in a brigade with the other Wisconsin regiments and the 19th Indiana. They are the only brigade made up of entirely of Western regiments. And Gibbon gets them their new uniforms, and they start becoming called either the Western Regiment, sometimes they're called the Black Hat Regiment, like my Black Hat pin, the Iron Brigade pin I have. And they wait around. One of the notable, one of my favorite stories, and one may or may not be true, is that there was a big review in November of '62 they're part of. and some Unitarian dignitaries come to watch it. And during the course of the review, or just after it's over, there's a warning of the Confederates doing something not far off. And so there's sort of a scramble to assemble. The 6th Wisconsin is sent back to his camp, of course, and they marched back. Well, one of the Unitarians in this group is Julia Ward Howe. And she's so inspired by what she saw that night that back in a hotel room that night, she writes the words to what comes to be called the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Rufus Dawes, who you can hear much more about in a minute, believed that the 6th Wisconsin, who had started singing John Brown's Body Lies a Moldering in the Grave, which is the tune to which the battle hymn is set later on, they are singing this on the way back. He believes the rest of his life, and he writes this in his memoir, that Howe was inspired by the 6th Wisconsin. And that's kind of their most notable contribution to the war there in the fall of 1861, I should say. Howe never says what regiment it was that she's with when she hears this, but it is one of these stories that comes down through the years for the 6th Wisconsin. So I want to get back to Rufus Dawes. He kind of embodies the experiences of the 6th Wisconsin. And so I'm not going to go through all my themes in a very sort of academic way, but I do want to talk about some stories that I think represent the themes that I highlight in the book. Rufus Dawes was a native of Marietta, Ohio, and in fact, he'd been a student at Marietta College. He'll return to Marietta after the war. But his parents, which this is the beginning of an unusual part of his story, are divorced, which is a very unusual thing in the 1850s. And his father moves to Wisconsin, at least part-time. He owns land there. And so summers, Rufus is required to go west and work on farms that his father owns. He also attends the University of Wisconsin for a time. He hates it in Wisconsin. He's in Juneau County, northwest of Madison, if you know the geography of the state. He's bored, it's hard work. He makes fun in his diary of the people. They have odd accents, and instead of saying cheering, they say cheerin'. They just have this Wisconsin accent that you can still pick up from now and again. But he kind of, the place grows on him a bit. On his 22nd birthday, which is the 4th of July, he's actually chosen by locals to read the Declaration of Independence, which is a very customary thing for a small town to have as part of the July 4th festivities. And he leads the procession through the town. He had previously been a very avid campaigner for Abraham Lincoln 2 years before, a year before, and had given speeches all over the county on behalf of Lincoln. And he is starting to get used to the idea of being a leader and of these people needing a leader. And so when Fort Sumter is fired on and it surrenders in April of 1861, there is in Mauston, the county seat of Juneau County, a public meeting. It's a huge meeting in the courthouse. And there is, as often happens at these community meetings, war meetings they're often called, a petition got up for men to pledge their lives basically to the Union. Dawes gets up, he's the first one to sign it. 47 other men make the same pledge as Dawes. And soon after, I think even that night, at least some of those men form a group called the Lemonweir Minutemen. Again, you're probably familiar with all these local companies that are created in the aftermath of Fort Sumter, the companies that will eventually become Company A or C or D or whatever of regiments. And they form a company and they elect Dawes captain. So he's gone from a kind of a sassy, somewhat arrogant college boy at the age of 19 and 20, making fun of the people he's living among, to becoming a leader of the first group from Juneau County to offer themselves to the Union Army. He was overjoyed. He's really delighted about this. I am captain of as good and true a bunch of patriots as ever rallied under the Star-Spangled Banner, he wrote his sister that letter. My men are terribly in earnest, and they will stand by me to death. In fact, just to kind of flash forward a little bit, 22 of the men who signed that pledge, so it was published in the newspapers, so we know who they were, ended up in the 6th Wisconsin, most of them in Company K, which was where the Lemon-Weir Minutemen ended up. And over half of them would be either killed, wounded, or missing in action during the course of the war. And as we'll see much later, Dawes had a very strong feeling about this. So Dawes becomes captain of Company K. That means that they're the last company to come in. There are 10 companies, A through K. The last ones arrive at Camp Randall. He's desperately, learning how to become an officer, like all these other volunteer officers in this first cohort of junior officers as the Army expands extremely quickly and in a drastic way. And by summer of 62, he's actually major. I mean, he's third in command. And when they get into their first battle at Gainesville, which again is the day or two before Second Bull Run, and the brigade commanded by John Gibbon and the Wisconsin, Indiana regiments are kind of ambushed by Stonewall Jackson and his entire wing of the Confederate Army. It's like a 1.5 hour fight, standing up, shooting each other from 70 yards away. The Wisconsin and Indiana regiments are well outnumbered, but hold their own. They fall back slowly. And it's a dramatic moment for them. They've proven their worth. Their colonel is wounded and will actually be out of commission for quite a while. And so Dawes becomes second in command. Over the course of the next several weeks, the 6th Wisconsin will fight 4 battles. Gainesville, 2nd Manassas, where they have a relatively minor role. South Mountain, where they will, in fact, get their nickname, the Iron Brigade, and then Antietam. By the end of those 6 weeks, they will have lost well over half their men. The regimental surgeon has to fill out a report every month about what's happened in the previous 30 days. And he has a long checklist of conditions, hundreds of illnesses that he could, there's 3 guys, 5 guys, 10 guys. At the end of end of September, he only checks off one, and it's the Latin word for gunshot wound. And I think 240 men in the 6th Wisconsin have suffered from a gunshot wound, either killed or wounded during that time. And so it's a pretty dramatic baptism of fire. Now, they don't have a lot more fighting between that time and the summer of 63. And Dawes's, and really the regiment's moment of glory comes at Gettysburg, July 1st of 1863, as the Army of the Potomac has changed commanders to George Gordon Meade. Lee's army has invaded Maryland and now Pennsylvania. Again, you probably know more or less the story of the Army of the Potomac kind of pivoting to stay between Baltimore and Washington and the Confederates. But they're finally gathering. And on July 1st, as you probably know, the first encounter between Union and Confederate forces at Gettysburg, this little crossroads town in far southern Pennsylvania, begins. And the 6th Wisconsin starts, and the Iron Brigade starts that day just a few miles from Gettysburg. But they don't know what's going on yet. And so they know they're moving toward trouble. And so July 1st found the 6th Wisconsin, the rest of the brigade, marching toward Gettysburg. And that morning, Dawes was in command. The interim commander, named Edward Bragg, had been kicked by a horse, and so he was gone as well. So Dawes is commanding the 6th Wisconsin on this day. And that morning, he had 340 men with him, intending to make a show on the streets of Gettysburg when they arrived. He had brought the drum corps to the front of the regiment. There are a couple of fifers, I believe. He unfurled the colors, and they started playing "The Campbells Are Coming," famous Scottish march. And the regiment had closed ranks, swung into step. It was quite a sight. The people would infer, he thought, writing in his memoirs years later, the people would infer that the rebels are running or would run very soon after so fine a body of soldiers of 6th Wisconsin confronted them. No, he was kidding, partly. Well, before they actually got to Gettysburg, the south of town, they hear firing in the distance, and the battle has ensued. The Iron Brigade is very quickly ordered to leave the road and head toward what we now know as Seminary Ridge. The Iron Brigade goes into action there in McPherson's farm, and the Iron Brigade does a great work that day. By that time, there's the 24th Michigan, another Western regiment, has been attached. The 6th Wisconsin is not a part of that. They are held in reserve. And ultimately, because the Union forces to the right, to the north of the Iron Brigade, have been forced back by Confederates. And Admiral Doubleday, then commanding the corps to which they belong, ordered the 6th Wisconsin to basically shore up the right flank of the Iron Brigade, and basically the right flank of the Union line west of Gettysburg. And so Dawes writes about this a number of times. His memoir, he has a separate article he writes about. And he forms his men in line of battle. They double quick toward the Confederate, probably a regiment and parts of 2 other regiments facing them. So they're outnumbered again. And he has a great description. I'm going to read a bit of this description as they move toward the enemy. We were now receiving a fearfully destructive fire from the hidden enemy. Men who had been shot were leaving the ranks in crowds. Any correct picture of this charge would represent a V-shaped crowd of men with the colors at the advance point, with him next to the colors, moving firmly and hurriedly forward, while the whole field behind is streaming with men who had been shot and who are struggling in the rear or sinking in death upon the ground. At least one of them is pleading with, he's badly wounded, pleading with his comrades to shoot him, to put him out of his misery, and none of them, as Dawes says, has the courage to do that. The only commands I gave as we advanced were align on the colors, close up on that color, close up on that color. The 6th crashed into the 2nd Mississippi, which is the primary regiment, who are taking cover in what is now the famous unfinished railroad cut. This is a cut through a hill for a new rail line being put in running west of Gettysburg. It's a natural trench, basically. And that's where the 2nd Mississippi is. And that's where the 6th Wisconsin is headed. They crash into their line, as I said, kind of trapping them in the railroad cut. A quick thinking officer sends a few men around to one end. They get a flanking fire onto the 2nd Mississippi. And after a few minutes of hand-to-hand fighting, which muskets being used as clubs, bayoneting actually going on, which is a fairly unusual thing in a Civil War battle, a flag being captured. In fact, the man that captures the flag in of the 2nd Mississippi receives the only Medal of Honor that the 6th Wisconsin receives. And ultimately, they surrender. Dawes has this kind of funny story, and he thinks it's funny, he finds the commander and he surrenders his sword, which is traditional. But ultimately, 5 or 6 other guys also surrendered the swords to Dawes. He said, honor would have told me to tell him to keep it, but this was a new thing to me. And so he's kind of carrying these swords around, and he usually ends up giving it to somebody else who takes them into town. They capture about 230 Confederates. They save the day, in effect, briefly holding up the Confederate advance, giving Union units time to arrive on the field, and along with a couple of other notable points of resistance, they managed to, again, buy time for the main units to come up and take over Cemetery Ridge, which will be the key to the battle as it progresses. The 6th has little to do the rest of the battle. They're kind of stationed near Culp's Hill, if you know the battle well enough. But they take very few casualties. They've lost half their men again in this particular battle, though. On July 4th, after the fighting is over, the Confederates are kind of hovering around. Dawes spends his birthday burying bodies, finding comrades, but just and it's the worst job in the world, as you might imagine, burying bodies on a Civil War battlefield. Dawes pretty much is commander of the regiment through the rest of the year. Bragg remains on sick duty. Dawes becomes official commander in May 1864, just as the fighting in the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Petersburg occurs. I mentioned these before. I mentioned the horrific casualties that, well, not just the 6th, but the 6th suffers along with most of the regiments in these awful battles. And again, the way that the combat changes in ways that the men notice and are despair. It causes a great despair, and they don't exactly know what their mission is, and so forth. And Dawes gets married in the meantime, and he writes his wife, "I am ready to stand by the country and at the post of peril as long as any other man. But after staying here about 16 times as long as the average," I'm not sure where he got that number, but he is the only officer he thinks in the regiment not to be wounded at least once. "I believe my first duty is now at home." He just feels like his streak of good luck is going to end. It weighs on him. "I know you are praying for me and suffering as only few can know," but he could not write false hopes of escaping forever. So he does leave. He does not re-enlist in 1864. He settles down in Marietta, and within a year, Mary, his wife, gives birth, to their first child, Charles, who would become Vice President of the United States under President Calvin Coolidge. So Dawes is a very specific story, iconic kind of hero of the Civil War. I'm a very different kind of guy. And again, this is partly represents the changing nature of warfare, but also the evolution of the regiment. And it's one of the 475 draftees. This is a very unusual document. I was this from the Gettysburg Battlefield Library, even though this guy had nothing to do with Gettysburg. J.B. Ingalls, who is a blacksmith with a family who had been drafted. He's in his late 30s. He has 4 kids, back home. And he's drafted in mid-November, sent to Camp Randall, where he's held for 3 weeks with a bunch of other draftees, and finally joins the 6th late December. They have kind of a long and wearying journey. And he is a complainer. He does not like this. He had, of course, hoped to escape going to the Army at all. He thinks he has some kind of promise that he'll be able to get a non-combatant job when he gets to the Army. That does not work out. But he kind of hangs on to that slender hope. In Camp Randall, he complains about the rough ways and foul language of the other draftees. "I tell you, this is a hard place. Lots of Dutchmen," which in his word means Germans, "jabber, jabber, jabber all the time," he sighed. "I look around me and ask, can I stand it a year?" Draftees enlisted for a year once they were drafted. "Oh, my heart almost fails me." On the journey to Virginia from Camp Randall, they're going to City Point eventually, which is the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac in southwestern Virginia. From the time they left, he writes later, "We have been strictly guarded. How mean it makes one feel, while he is conscious that he has done nothing wrong. The officers were martinets. The guards observed their eating, washing, and tending to the calls of nature. They spend hours, once they're back in Virginia, They spend hours at a time standing in the rain and cold, waiting for food, for orders, or any kind of attention. They notice a bullpen, he calls it, where prisoners of various kinds are being held and being mistreated and punished by having, being hung up by their thumbs, having signs hung around them. On December 13th, for the first time, they hear a cannon fire in the distance, and also see 5 deserters who they believe, been told, have been sentenced to death. When one of the draftees that he knows gets too close to a Confederate prisoner, he's stabbed. And this is not a surprising complaint, you cannot imagine, he wrote, on a day when they're asked to stand in line waiting for rations next to the line of latrines. You cannot imagine the stench that is there, and all on an empty stomach. They finally arrive at the 6th Wisconsin after a long, hard train journey where they ride on top of train cars and march through the devastated countryside with ruined mansions and mud. And he finally gives up on becoming a nurse or some other non-combatant, takes a gun, and starts learning how to be a soldier. By the first of the year, they start hearing distant firing almost every day. They're not treated very nicely by the sergeants and other officers that they encounter during that time. His diary, which ends in February with this discussed, I have to get me a hat with the bugles, the black hat with the turned up side, with a bugle, the 6 and E and a feather. I mean, the 6th Wisconsin Company E, and they wear pretty snazzy feathers. Oh, how I hate the whole thing from beginning to end. This is not, of course, how the 6th Wisconsin of 1861 thought about themselves. And I don't know if Ingalls is a representative draftee. He does survive. He comes out okay. Does not join the GAR or any other veterans organization, as far as I can tell. But this would have shocked the old timers. And so I want to tell 2 other stories that were told for years. And the long Civil War, as I said, is partly about storytelling and about meanings that soldiers took from their experiences. The first is very noble, very typical, and is told a lot in the 20, 30 years after the war. The first story features 2 prisoners taken in the brutal fighting of May 1864. Excuse me. One is a captain named Converse, who is severely wounded, dying. Another is a sergeant named Frank Hare, also wounded, both in the leg. Hare will actually lose his leg and live until the 1890s or turn of the century. Converse believes he's dying, and he is. And he also believes the Confederate surgeon is eyeing him he's going to mess around with him when he really just wants to die in peace. And somehow Captain Converse had hidden a pistol in his uniform, and he gave it to Hare, Sergeant Hare, and said to prevent the surgeon from taking his leg, because he just wanted, again, to die in peace. And so Frank grabbed the pistol and faced down the Confederate guards who had threatened him. "What do you suppose I care for my life with my leg gone?" the captain declared. "Kill me if you will, but that man is my," I'm sorry, that's Frank O'Hare. "Kill me if you will, but that man is my captain. And so long as I have strength to shoot, it will be dangerous for any man to touch him while he lives." A rebel officer tells the guards and the surgeon to stand down and remarked wistfully, nodding toward Hare, "I would like a regiment of such men." Converse responded with defiant last words, and supposedly he dies after this. "I have the honor to command 100 such men. The North is full of them, and sooner or later we shall triumph, and your rebel flag will be trailed in the dust." Well, it's easy to see why this story appeared so often and for so long. It's often mentioned when Hare comes up in reminiscences or newspaper articles. But these 2 men represent the best motivations and the most soldierly memories of the 6th Wisconsin and was cherished for decades. A very different story, and I think it helps suggest the complications of the war revolved around a young officer named Edward Brooks. He happened to be the lieutenant that had taken the group of men around the flank of the 2nd Mississippi at Gettysburg and kind of won the day for them. And he's a pleasant, active, ambitious, very young officer. And in the summer of 1864, he decides, he comes up with an idea during the kind of the stalemate outside Petersburg. And he actually writes a letter directly to General Grant, asking for permission. Grant gives him permission. And here's the plan. He'll pick 30 guys from the Iron Brigade. That will include about 8 or 9 from the 6th Wisconsin. Put them on horses. They'll go behind the lines, the Confederates, and burn railroad bridges. That's the idea. Well, it doesn't work out very well. The first night out, he fails to put out guards. In the morning, they are captured by a group of farmers with shotguns and one Confederate officer who happened to be home on leave. And somehow Brooks panics. He is made to believe they're surrounded by Confederates, and they surrender. They all, of course, go to prison camps. One of the survivors of those prison camps, a guy named Thomas Newton, wrote 20 years later, he made a bold claim that they were betrayed, perhaps by Brooks, perhaps by some other traitor. He wrote, "We were sold, bought for a price, because we could not prove it. All we could do was to suffer the consequences of which tongue cannot describe or pen portray." And in fact, I think the Brooks story is told as often as the Hare/Converse story. It's a very different story. It's about betrayal. It's about tragedy. It's about, it's really an extended story about the horrors of Confederate prison camps. And that is the nature of every time it comes up, that here's the long-term effects. And in fact, a number of these guys never recover. In their pension file, which I looked at a number of them, they have asthma and heart troubles and rheumatism, and whenever it comes up, it's Brooks. When Brooks died, his death offered another chance to repeat the story. There was the Sunday Telegraph was a newspaper in Milwaukee published by 4 really veterans. And the obituary said, "Poor little Ed Brooks. His life was not what he expected it to be, and was, in some respects, a disappointment to his friends." Brooks went off, had a short journalist career, never returned to Wisconsin, and died in Washington alone, while living with his mother, unmarried and unwanted by his comrades. So 2 really different long-term stories. Finally, I want to end with a little more uplifting and going back to Dawes. As I said, Dawes returns to Marietta. He's a successful businessman. He has a lumber business, very active in the Grand Army of the Republic, the main veterans organization for Union veterans. His family grows up around him, including a grandson named Rufus. After him, he serves a term in Congress from Ohio. And during that time, in 1881, taking a break from his duties at the Capitol, Dawes crosses the river and visits Arlington National Cemetery to worship at the Shrine of the Dead, as he put it. Of course, this is the old campground, of the regiment. His mission that day was to find the graves of my friends and comrades, poor fellows, who followed my enthusiastic leadership in those days, followed it to the death, which I, by merciful providence, escaped. And he found about 24, I think these are the guys that signed the pledge that night in Boston, Wisconsin, 20 years before. He located those gravestones among the 16,000 by that time in the cemetery. And so it was a fraught moment. He recalled the excitement. He recalled the drama. He recalled, I think, his excitement of being elected captain of this company. But the occasion also made him reflect on the past, on the ways in which the war had tempered that enthusiasm and shaped his ambition, both as an officer and as a civilian after the war. His regiment had camped on these very grounds, he remembered, when they first reached the war. And he had imagined, and he didn't talk about this at the time, but he had imagined perhaps looking across the Potomac, and the Capitol Dome wasn't yet done, perhaps one day serving in Congress. Now at middle age, in 1981, he's about 40, 42 years old. Now at middle age, with enthusiasm sobered by hard fights and hard facts, he stood with uncovered head at each of the graves of his old comrades and thought differently about ambition and service. Their deaths, their lives, actually, had inspired him to run for Congress, to, as he wrote, to stand for all they won in establishing our government upon freedom, equality, justice, liberty, and protection to the humblest. For what they died, he closed, and this is in the form of a letter to his wife, Mary. For what they died, I fight a little longer. Well, that sense of responsibility, that awareness of his role, that reflection on what it meant to have fought in the war and to have survived it, is probably the most moving example in my mind of what the long Civil War really means. And hopefully in the 6th Wisconsin and the long Civil War, there are many other meanings that you might be able to find from that. Thanks.